Great, it's 1 o'clock. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. We're the Association for Experiential Education. My name is Sherry Bagley. I'm the Executive Director. We are putting on this series of COVID-19 webinars and have been doing them for the last 2 weeks now to try to support our community and help out where we can. We ask and invite you to let us know what other resources you might need. If you have questions about things and you would like to see a specific webinar, let us know. We're happy to look into it and find some experts to help. If there are resources that you've found to be really helpful, feel free to send them to us. We can add them to our resource library. We're trying to all be here for each other during this time. So AE really appreciates your support and everyone gathering together to listen to these great webinars. You can still become a member of AE during this time. We are accepting memberships, and it's a great way to meet other people, talk about issues. We're going to be hosting some forums where people can get together and just chat rather than have a webinar, but just hang out and kind of share some issues around whether you're a challenge course facilitator or a K-12 educator, things like that. So please keep an eye on our website. It's www.aee.org. Lots of great information on there. And also feel free to email me at Sherry, SHERRY, @aee.org. So today we have Dr. Christine Norton and Lynette Spencer, who are going to share with us. Both of these wonderful women are longtime members of AEE. They have 50 years of combined experience between the two of them, and we're super glad to hear the information they have today. It's really important that we take care of ourselves in this time and take care of our families while we're so close to them. So we really appreciate you both taking the time out of your busy schedules and doing this for us today. And with that, Christine, I'll let you get started. And if we have any questions, I'll let you know. And thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Sherry. We're really excited to be here. You know, Sherry, you had asked me if I wanted you to ask our audience, our participants, any questions, and I originally had said no, but true to form for doing group work and experiential education, I think it is sort of important to know who's in the room. So I don't know if there's any way to just have people write in the chat box. Are you a mental health professional? Are you an outdoor educator? Are you a teacher? Are you a challenge course practitioner? Are you a corporate trainer? We would just love to know, are you a mom, a dad, you know, sort of who our audience is. We recognize, I think there are about 300 people that had registered. So we're curious who you are and hope that we can tailor our presentation to meet your needs. I'm going to let my colleague, Lynette Spencer, introduce herself a little bit, and then I will introduce myself a bit more. We're hoping to make this a little bit sort of like a conversation between the two of us as mental health practitioners, and then invite you into that conversation as well.
Thank you, Christine. And thank you, Sherry, for inviting us to be here and doing this today. I was excited for the opportunity to do this. You'll all have to bear with me. It's my first webinar experience on this end of it, at least. And so I'm really just Christine's sidekick for this, I think, is my role. But I do appreciate the opportunity, and as many of you know me through AdventureWorks, I have both a nonprofit adventure therapy agency in Northern Illinois and also a private practice counseling agency called Action Consulting and Therapy. We're in the western Chicago suburbs. So up here in Northern Illinois, there's not a lot of topography, but there's a lot that we can do with nature and experiences for clients. And so that's sort of been our thing for the last 10 years or so. And that's the length I've also been involved with AEE, so I'm happy to, super happy to be a part of this. And then, of course, the AdventureWorks is also a member of the Outdoor Behavioral Healthcare Council, and we're an accredited member of AEE through the OBH accreditation. and I'm the chair of the OBH Council. So both of the worlds coming together for me in this great field of ours. So happy to be here.
Thanks, Lynette. So Lynette and I are both licensed clinical social workers. I'm actually an associate professor of social work at Texas State University, and I am also a research scientist with the Outdoor Behavioral Healthcare Council, the center actually. And so I do a lot of research in the area where Lynette is currently practicing, but we both have a practice background in clinical social work. And so we're sort of bringing that social work lens to this presentation, as well as the outdoor therapy lens to the work that we do. And then also I am a certified clinical trauma professional and a certified experiential therapist. So again, bringing some of that to this webinar as much as possible. So we just really want to be clear with you all. I'm going to go to the next screen about some of the objectives for this training. And I definitely want to reiterate what you said, Lynette, about thanking the Association for Experiential Education for this opportunity, really just to serve in this tough time. If you're like me, maybe you're sitting at home feeling like, oh my God, what can I be doing right now? Or maybe you're one of those people that is on the front lines of this crisis. And so either way, we really want to make sure that we're developing a very caring community in which mental health disorders are not stigmatized. I think normalizing and getting rid of the stigma around mental health is the first step. And right now, I would just want to underscore that all of us have an increased vulnerability. And so doing this training in the time of COVID-19 was really our motivation. We want to help distinguish again between positive mental health and mental health disorders and help you really understand what the signs and symptoms of mental health vulnerability look like, including trauma and the impact that trauma and our past sort of trauma histories can have in terms of how we cope with what we're facing right now. Of course, because we're clinical social workers, we want to be strengths-based. I would say also as experiential educators, we're problem solvers and wanting to shift the conversation into skills for psychological recovery and wellness. And we really do want to make this personal and professional. So if you are a helper, then some of the tips and things that we're going to talk about, you'll probably already know. But I guess we would invite you to turn the lens sort of on yourself and make sure that you're doing okay as well as a helper. We're also going to bring in some experiential therapy theory for you in terms of how we can frame this as helpers, the experience that we're in together in this global pandemic. And then obviously we're going to leave you with some good resources. So sort of moving along, Lynette and I were talking about, there we go, talking about the current crisis. I was on the phone this morning with an ER social worker, and I was asking her if she's seeing a spike in mental health issues, suicide in particular, and she said yes. And so I went to PsychHub, which is Patrick Kennedy's website, and if you go there, it is, I listed it at the end of the presentation. It's a wealth of resources, but it's really interesting. There's already some current research showing that 63% of people responding to a recent McKinsey report report feeling anxious and depressed right now. Suicide hotlines are fielding more and more calls every day. And then a study that came out from China, which is again, not shocking at all, is that 70% of their healthcare workforce are experiencing some form of psychological distress. Those are the people that are the helpers during this time. And the research is also showing, right, that as we go through this global pandemic, that we're going to see increasing rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, substance abuse. And then Lynette, we were talking too about this idea of the increased vulnerability around domestic violence and child abuse. I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that, because I know you're working in community-based mental health.
Yeah, and in our community in particular, and I don't think we're any different than any other community, but the domestic violence shelter, their hotline, their intake services, their shelter services are seeing much less utilization. It's the utilization of the intake or inquiry calls, calls for help have gone down dramatically, while the police calls for domestic violence have gone up fairly significantly. And so we're just seeing a removal of outreach for help. It's suppressed right now. And I think that in addition to domestic violence, and then one of the biggest concerns in the domestic violence world is the use of telehealth is just not safe in many of those situations, because there's no way for the person to leave to get the privacy that they need to have their telehealth session. So domestic violence is one of those areas of concern for both victims of domestic violence in terms of adult versus adult domestic violence, but also for children who are in abuse situations. That there's just not the level of control and the lack of privacy in their homes is not conducive to seeking help electronically right now.
That's a great point. Well, and one of the things we talked about is when you're in crisis mode, you tend to just do what you need to do to get through the moment, right? And we put this slide up here as sort of our like, woo, woo, warning. Don't ignore your mental health. And sorry for the gross blister shot, but those of you who are outdoor folks will know what we're talking about is a hotspot, sort of a psychological hotspot, right? And if you're out hiking and you're trying to get from point A to point B on a wilderness expedition, you know that you can't ignore that little rock in your shoe or that little spot on your foot. And I think that Lynette and I really want to encourage people to pay attention to that psychologically as well. And we understand the barriers of being either, out on the front lines dealing with this crisis, or even feeling trapped or stuck in your home. There are barriers on both sides, but we're going to give you some resources, like I said, at the end, both personal resources and also professional resources, so that you don't have to wait until the crisis erupts. Sort of like what you were saying, Lynette, about the help seeking and the utilization of services is diminishing, but the crisis is increasing. And I think that that's a little bit because people are just doing what they need to do to get through and not taking the time to really look at what's happening internally.
Yeah, and then the consequences of waiting are the longer lasting impact of the mental distress and the problems that I don't know what I want to try to say, but like the snowball effect of that. The fallout from that is just going to go on way after the country develops a vaccine or a test that can alarm us to an illness that we don't know we have. So I think it's important to pay attention to those hotspots.
Mm-hmm. And I think I don't know, maybe Sherry can weigh in here in a little bit, how many of you are working in mental health in some form or another, but I do feel like this will be something we need to keep thinking critically about as an opportunity for caregiving after the sheltering in place and after the sort of immediate part of the crisis. There will be sort of those ongoing consequences where we will need to play a role to really help one another keep healing. Mm-hmm. So, we wanted to. Yeah,
I was going to say,
there's Sherry.
Hello. It looks like we have there are some counselors, but we have a lot of facilitators, a lot of program coordinators, moms.
Pray for mom.
Yeah, but it's a mix. Academic program manager, outdoor educator and supervisor, assistant director, junior high teacher, and Hope Squad advisor. So there's
awesome.
a lot of variance. So
yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And I feel like on one level, when you have a lot of variance in a webinar like this, you risk not hitting anyone, and then you also have the benefit of probably hitting everyone somewhere. So hopefully each of you will get something you can take away. Thanks so much, Sherry, for letting us know. One of the things that Lynette, you and I were talking about is just how do we even define what mental health is or what it looks like? And we were sort of joking that the framework in America, it's very individualistic. It's sort of about like my well-being and my ability to cope, and leave it to the Canadians to be a little more collectivist. The Public Health Agency of Canada has this beautiful graphic that we wanted to share with you just to conceptualize the different layers about what positive mental health looks like. That there are these individual concepts, but then there are these family and community and societal constructs as well. And we felt like it was important to give this baseline for what positive mental health looks like, so that we have this sort of place to come back to and to work towards as we're also addressing maybe some of our vulnerability. Did you want to say anything?
I'll just add that this is also a very social work view. The systems perspective of mental health is probably the lens that we're looking at it through.
Right. And I know all of us right now, may be experiencing a diminishing of some of our connections to these different layers or levels of well-being. Maybe we're not as connected societally or to our communities or to our families. And so we're going to be talking a lot about connection and how to maintain those connections throughout this really hard time. And Zoom, if y'all are like me, and Lynette, I know you've been on a ton of calls lately too, probably already like Zoomed out, webinared out, but just having a little time for that human connection can be important. So we want to highlight also that mental health is a continuum. I think sometimes we think in very black and white terms when we apply a medical model, which is either you're sick or you're healthy. And really what we know is that there's a lot of variance in between the two sides of the continuum. We also want to highlight that the onset typically for mental health disorders is in youth and young adulthood. And that doesn't mean that as adults over the age of 24 that we're not that we're immune to the development of mental health issues, but there is a greater vulnerability in youth and young adulthood. And the other thing that I want to highlight with this continuum framework is that recovery and mental health recovery is also a part of that. It's not just once you've been diagnosed with a mental health disorder that's necessarily the struggle that you will be facing the rest of your life, that there are aspects of recovery, and we really want to be able to talk about those as well.
Yeah, I would also add that all of us are going to move throughout the continuum at various places throughout our lives, that it's a very fluid continuum throughout developmental stages and situational challenges that we face.
Yeah. And don't you feel that right now, Lynette? Like it's almost like, not even was it a good day or was it a good week? It's like moment by moment, I bet a lot of us feel ourselves shifting a little bit on this continuum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So when we look at defining mental health, I think part of our hope with this training is to distinguish that even though there's some normative movement on that continuum, that it's important to look also again at those indicators of both positive mental health, but also a mental health disorder. And so what we hope for, right, when we wake up and maybe get dressed, I don't know, I actually had to do my hair and makeup today, which was probably a small victory considering I've been in my jammies like forever. But again, assessing like, am I feeling emotionally balanced? Is my mind working okay? Am I having those positive peer interactions? Am I performing as well as I can right now in all of these different domains? And is there some flexibility with how I'm coping? And then obviously the opposite is also something we need to look at. Lynette, do you want to say anything about that? Just sort of when you're starting to feel like a little out of balance with those things?
Well, I think it's important to know yourself and know where your supports are, and know what if you know intrinsically what you need to do for yourself, if you know what works for you, pay attention to that. If you don't, then reach out and get some support and figure that out. And I think that we're going to talk about that a little bit later in terms of having a guidebook for yourself. So we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Great. So in normal times, That's what I'll say. In normal times, the mental health vulnerability, the prevalence is, depending on the study that you're looking at, about 1 in 5 adults and about 1 in 5 children have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder at any given time. And again, if you go back to some of the more recent research that was posted on PsychHub about what's happening during COVID-19, it was more like 63% of adults were saying, I'm experiencing some kind of anxiety or depression. So again, these statistics about that 25%, that's more normative, and we're seeing an increase. But even in normal times, it's really common for us. And this is, a lot of this is North American research, but it's really common for us to struggle with mental health. And so again, I show you the prevalence rates because we really want to normalize. And what I say to my clients and to my students is there is no shame in the struggle. I think when we see prevalence rates, on one hand, it could make us go, whew, wow, we really struggle as a human species. And on the other hand, maybe it's sort of like, yeah, we struggle as a human species, and that's okay.
Well, and I think we also all have all the emotions. We're born, we're just made of these emotions, and we all experience panic at one point or another, whether we're stepping off the curb and almost, not seeing the car that's coming and getting out of the way just in time. We feel that panic, and so any situation or anything that we're involved in can bring about any one of these emotions. And it's just that sometimes it suddenly hits us in a really big way, like your life has stopped and now you can't go to you can't be with your friends, or you can't go to your favorite restaurant and have your favorite meal sitting down with your family. You can't have Easter dinner. And so when all of these limitations are imposed upon us, those emotions that we're just humanly capable of are going to show themselves.
Yeah, and sometimes overwhelm our ability to cope, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing, is this idea of giving ourselves space to feel what we're feeling, and then also be aware of when those feelings are really, really taking over and overwhelming our ability to sort of face what we still have in front of us in our lives. A lot of times, Lynette, as mental health professionals, I don't know if your experience has been this way with your clients, but people will sort of ask, like, why? Why is this happening to me? Why, am I struggling in this way? Why am I like this? And Lynette and I pulled out, some of the research. I once saw a cartoon that said, the nature-nurture debate is obsolete. Either way, it's mom's fault. That was for all you moms on the call. But I really do think that the research shows that it is the relationship between the person, the individual, our individual genetics, our biology, our DNA, our history, our intergenerational patterns, and our history, as well as then the environment that we're in.
Yeah, and I would say definitely sometimes why is really important to explore and understand, and sometimes knowing why doesn't make a difference, and you have to get better. You have to work toward getting better, and spending time in why is a timing thing. You don't want to do that when you need to get better. Sometimes you need to get better to be able to reflect and figure out why. Yeah. So it's a priority issue. You have to decide what comes first.
Right. Well, and I wanted to highlight again around some of these environmental stressors. The Association for Experiential Education has really been doing a lot of good work around deconstructing privilege over the last, 5 to 10 years, really looking at how we see so much through the lens of our privilege. And when I hear stories right now about the disproportionate rates of how this virus is affecting communities of color and people who are homeless and people who are undocumented, and again, those same isms, right? They compound problems with mental health. And then if you don't have access, like Lynette was talking about, to getting the mental health services, it can really, again, just add layers and layers of challenge. And I think that's important to acknowledge. Some of us have the ability to, experience mental health vulnerability and then access support and help for it, which is what we're trying to encourage. I also know I posted there's a crisis text line at the end that we'll share with you. And, that is something that anyone can access, and also people can sign up to volunteer to serve in that capacity, because our levels of access are just really different. I think that's important to acknowledge. So again, common misperceptions. What do we usually think about when we think about mental health challenges, right? There are a lot of really nasty ways of explaining mental health vulnerability: crazy, insane, nuts, imbalanced, and weak. The stigma, I think, that we face really teaches us that if we have any kind of mental health vulnerability, that we're not strong. And I think Lynette and I, as clinicians, know that people who face their mental health challenges head on are some of the bravest people in the world. We know, like the hotspot, if you ignore the problem, it will not go away. That's a common misperception, that it will. I think the other thing that's interesting is, we've seen some folks with the virus think that there are certain people who will be immune to the virus. And I think the virus has proven itself to be an equal opportunity companion, let's say. And I think mental health is the same way. Healthy people are affected by mental illness, and not everyone responds the same. So these are just some of the common misperceptions. Lynette, are there any others that you see in sort of your practice or your community that you wanted to address?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are some of the big ones. I think it's becoming less and less stigmatized. Hopefully, that's certainly one of our goals. We try to make counseling fun at AdventureWorks. Adventure therapy and experiencing adventure and different opportunities with kids and with our clients is really our way of making the stigma go away. Our kids tell other kids that they should come to AdventureWorks. If their parents are making them go to counseling or something, but it's just something. Mental health is something that we have to acknowledge is our friend. It's in our families. It's in we experience it ourselves. It's not something we can ignore. It's not something that shows weakness. Everything that you've already said, but it's just so important.
I love how Daniel Siegel refers to, he's sort of talking about mindfulness practice, but he refers to taking care of our mental well-being as mental hygiene. So we talk about dental hygiene. We'll do a poll. Raise your hand if you floss this morning. Right? We won't put you on the spot like that. But but we know that we normalize things like taking care of our teeth, but yet when it comes to taking care of our minds, we still get a little scared of looking at that. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is get rid of that fear and that stigma.
And I think let me just add one more thing about looking at ourselves. It's this time alone, this downtime that we have, not being able to fill the gaps of time with running to going to the grocery store at the whim, or going out with friends. You can't really fill all your time if you're at home, especially if you live alone. You're going to see yourself. And I think that part, that's a good thing sometimes.
That was the perfect segue. When Lynette and I were preparing this webinar, we thought about obviously wanting to bring up the clinical aspects of mental health on a more individual level, but we also wanted to just sort of hold space for the fact that we're all having a shared experience around vulnerability right now. And this collective experience, I'm sure that you all, and feel free to write in the chat box if that feels therapeutic or helpful to share that, other things that we might have missed. But Lynette, these were some of the things I think a lot, you mentioned the time at home, time with ourselves and needing to confront ourselves. Do you want to talk about some of these other things as well?
I'm not sure I'm following you in terms of.
We're on the slide talking about grief and loss and some of those experiences that everyone is feeling, regardless of whether or not we're seeing like mental health challenges, but just the vulnerability that all of us are having.
Yeah, and I think there are 4 examples of loss that are listed there, and each one of the people on the call can probably come up with 10 more losses in their lives. I think that loss is just a blanket experience for us. And acknowledging that, I just think acknowledging that and being comfortable with the emotions that come about when you're acknowledging the changes, the losses, the challenges, whatever it is that you're facing as a result of the pandemic. And then recognizing for those of us that are helpers, those of us who are working with either supervising staff or seeing clients or working with students, whatever it might be with our children, recognizing that we are having this shared experience that is no different from each other. And so a lot of times in my work with clients, I'll be able to relate to some of the things and some of the experiences that they've had, but not the blanket experience that none of us have ever experienced this much of a shared experience. I can't even, even in terms of 9/11, thinking about, I remember where I was and what happened and what I watched on the news, and I remember all the details of that day, but they also weren't happening in Illinois. And this is happening everywhere.
Yeah. I know I was thinking too about, along with loss, where some of the other challenges come from, that we and in our federal and state governments, we might be experiencing things like disaster capitalism and greed versus really empathic, solid leadership. And I know that for a lot of communities, there's moral outrage. There's moral outrage that our healthcare workers don't have the PPE that they need. There's moral outrage that communities of color are disproportionately affected. There's moral outrage that potentially some of this could have been prevented had people shown greater leadership. And so wherever you are in terms of conceptualizing the macro level environment, that moral outrage might also be adding to this level of just emotional exhaustion. And then I just want to normalize also, I've talked to people, Lynette, who are like, gosh, this is great. I'm working from home. I feel I'm slowing down. I'm getting outside more. And then those people feel incredible guilt because they know there's this weird cognitive dissonance that like, oh, I'm doing okay. And there is this incredible level of suffering just swirling all around me, even though it's not maybe impacting my world directly, which also I think is hard for people.
Yeah.
So I heard it said, right, we're all swimming in the same sea. We're all in this together. And so I think that that's important. Helpers, moms, for the first time I think of moms as helpers, dads as helpers. If you're a parent, you're in the same crisis that your kids are in. And so that's a really interesting metaphor for thinking about how do I sort of save a drowning swimmer when I feel a little in over my head as well. And I think the only response that I would have to that is just to take care of yourself, right? It's that whole airline safety, put your own mask on first. Shout out to Eric Boggs on that one, right? That you have to be able to engage in self-care. And I think also it's really important to know your own red flags. I start losing things. I start yelling at my kids. I feel like tension in my body. And so I think we wanted to just talk about some of these individual attributes and then obviously the social and environmental circumstances that create this stress and tension. And also talk about the fact that if you have an underlying history of trauma, that you may be a little bit more on edge right now than you normally are, and that's a really normal experience. Mm-hmm. Did you want to say anything more about that, Lynette? Just some of the red flags?
Yeah, no, I'm noticing in the chat that people are continuing to talk about the different losses, and it's a flood of losses. But yeah, so the challenge is just really, again, just knowing yourself and knowing where you're at and knowing what you need. Yeah, and be able to
Well,
recognize that.
yeah, and I apologize. I can't see the chat box because I'm sharing my screen. So Lynette will be my chat box monitor. I really appreciate that. And I think it's interesting because, sometimes we conceptualize trauma as a loss as well. Trauma maybe being an individual event, but maybe being a series of events that happened over time. And so if you experience that history of trauma and that history of loss in your life, and now there are these new things that are happening because of this pandemic, the two can be connected, right? It can bring up a lot of old stuff. And that's really exhausting, and it's really hard, and it's really painful. And yet I hear those people in my life who sort of speak wisdom into my life saying, you know what, Christine, this is also an opportunity, right? This is also an opportunity to sort of face some of those things and look at some of those things. And maybe not on my own, maybe with professional help and help from my support system. NAMI in the state of California has this beautiful infographic. NAMI is the National Alliance for Mental Illness. They're a consumer organization. Again, I think they're on the forefront of normalizing mental health in this country, and also really looking at mental health recovery. And I think that this is important. Lynette, we had talked about for this webinar, did we want to go through specific diagnoses and talk about specific signs and symptoms? And we sort of agreed that regardless of whether it's depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress, that these are some of the common warning signs that people might be facing, given the increasing levels of stress or maybe even pre-existing mental health challenges that folks have had.
Yeah. And then,
So,
the environmental and situational factors that are going to not only cause these symptoms, but then exacerbate them, because like I'm thinking about excessive use of alcohol or drugs. So liquor stores by and large have remained open, and just yesterday in Chicago, they announced that they would be closed at 9 p.m. every day. And so limiting access to alcohol, even if it's not great for you, not having it when you need it and not having the help to balance that is going to exacerbate the problems. It was just layers and layers and layers of different challenges along with this virus and your mental health.
Right. And I think one of the hard things is we know based on the research that social support is one of the biggest protective factors against mental illness, right? And so now if people are feeling really sad and withdrawn, we are physically distanced and physically isolated, and even physical touch and getting held and all those things that some people do not have in their lives right now. So again, we're showing you these common warning signs this is not like a scare tactic. This is to say we are honoring the collective vulnerability that we all have right now, and how this pandemic can, like Lynette said, really sort of exacerbate some of these things. So if you're noticing any of these things in yourself, don't be scared, but instead just sort of be curious and gentle with yourself about, wow, yeah, I haven't slept in 3 days, or I can't stop crying, or I'm feeling agitated all the time. My mind is racing. Being curious and then being gentle, I think, are going to be a couple of things that are going to really increase people's ability to seek out professional help if that's what is needed. So Mental Health America is another great resource for everyone. And you can see they have these 10 tools listed on the side of this web page here. And The one that's highlighted or not highlighted, I guess, is get professional help if you need it. Lynette and I are going to sort of backtrack a little bit with the rest of the webinar just to talk about what are some of the things that all of us can be doing to promote our own sense of well-being and psychological strength. But we also just wanted to say right away that if you're experiencing any of those warning signs of mental illness on a level where you are concerned about your own safety or someone else's safety, to really seek out professional help. Sherry, you're muted.
Thank you. We have a question about whether or not this, the hotline number that you're giving is good globally, or if it's just good for the United States.
I believe that it's just a US number, but actually I don't know. It's a 1-800 number. Does anyone on the chat know if a 1-800 number will work globally? I mean, you could call with the country code, I would imagine. I haven't tried it from another country.
It says no, somebody's saying no, 1-800 numbers don't work.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what we can, yeah. So I recognize, I'm not sure how many people we have internationally calling in, but what I would really encourage you to do is to sort of look for the resources in your own home country around mental health hotlines and mental health support. Because I do feel like those hotlines, the interesting thing about those hotlines is it's the first step, right? It's sort of like saying, I'm in the middle of a crisis and I need to take that first step. And I think, Lynette, what I feel is that first step is the hardest. The clients that I've worked with, it's like, that's the bravest step. Once you take that step, I feel like the other steps follow a little bit.
And in fact, many times people who call finally make the decision to call for a counseling appointment and they get an appointment set up. Sometimes they either cancel it or don't feel like they need it once they get to the appointment because they took care of themselves just by acknowledging it.
Yeah, great. So SAMHSA, again, I realize I'm speaking from a US perspective now that I know we have international folks on the call. Thanks for joining. SAMHSA is a substance abuse mental health services agency here in the United States, and they have a couple of really important tools. They have a psychological first aid training that they do, and then they have a model called Skills for Psychological Recovery. So this graphic is directly from their website, and I really like it because, again, similar to Mental Health America's sort of 10 tools, they've boiled down the research showing like, okay, what are the protective factors needed in all of our lives to stay mentally and emotionally healthy? And so you can see these make sense, right? They're things that we innately sort of know and understand. One of the things, Lynette, that you and I were talking about, though, is that if you look at psychological first aid, SAMHSA's model, it was really to help people get through a crisis. And then the building skills for psychological recovery is sort of a follow-up, like after the crisis is over. And I think I just want to acknowledge the really challenging thing about this pandemic is that we don't have an end in sight. There's so much we don't know. So as we're saying, these are skills to help you once the crisis is over. I think what we're sort of saying is we're in a new phase, and maybe these are things we just need to be making sure we have in place on an ongoing basis to get us through this time of uncertainty.
Yeah, they're not skills that we can wait to develop or to put into place. It just needs to be now, and it needs to be widely known that these are ways that we can take care of ourselves.
Yeah. And it's interesting, sometimes people don't really know what's meant by the information and prioritizing. We need to gather that information, right, about our own mental health and then prioritize our own self-care. That's sort of one way of framing it. But I also think, you've probably heard, and there's so much advice, right? We're all getting a lot of advice during this difficult time. But one of the things is sort of figure out a really good source, a scientifically based source of information during this crisis, and then prioritize how much information you can handle and the information that you need, and not to be connected to a news source 24/7. You've probably heard that. I just want to reiterate that again,
Yeah.
to really limit that.
As a therapist, I've always found it really important not to recommend a specific book or a specific source of information for clients. I guide them how to look and how to research for themselves, but then it's really what fits with them that's going to make a difference. If I prescribe something, that it'll be my interest level, and then they'll read it because I said so, or because they won't read it because they can't get into it. And whereas if they pick it out and it fits and that it just fits with them, then they're going to be much more inclined to use that resource.
I love that. I think that's a great segue. I skipped a slide and I'll go back to that, but I think this is exactly what you're saying, Lynette. We're not giving this webinar to be prescriptive. We're giving this webinar to help you assess your own well-being and the well-being of those around you based on some of these indicators of vulnerability, and then to figure out what works for you. So Patricia Deegan, she's sort of known in mental health recovery circles as the mother of mental health recovery. Her own story was one of early onset of schizophrenia when she was 18. She had to drop out of college, quit playing sports. Her journey was really, really hard through really acute and persistent mental illness. And she is amazing. If you haven't listened to her talks online, you can Google it, Patricia Deegan, Deegan. But she talks about how important it is to build and create your own personal wellness kit. Right? What works for me might not work for you, and what works for Lynette might not work for me, et cetera, et cetera. So, of course, because we're experiential therapists and experiential educators, we put some things that we believe in a lot, like spending time outside and mind-body practice and the love of our furry pets and art. But you know the things that draw out your sense of meaning, and you know the things that draw out your sense of joy and peace. And so we're really encouraging you, not to be prescriptive with you, but really encouraging you to prioritize this. What is it that helps you be well? And my hope, Lynette, I don't know about you, I'm terrible at this. Like I'm like all I do is work, and I'm one of those people that, to use a term a colleague and friend said the other day, I'm sometimes like pathologically busy. So my hope for myself is that after we get on the other side of this crisis, that I'll retain some of these tools, right? That I'll continue to prioritize self-care and my own well-being. I think we hope that for everyone listening to the call too.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think there's a lot of opportunity within this constraint that we have on our lives right now. And so it's just a matter of figuring that out and knowing what's going to work for us long term.
So how do we do that though? We need each other. I was a camp counselor, so I know all about the buddy system. Some of you probably have heard this term, but it's the idea, right, that we really can't do this work on our own. Every Sunday night, the Association for Experiential Education's Therapeutic Adventure Professional Group has a campfire, a virtual campfire. And one of the things that I realized was that I need my people to help me get through this. And the other thing I realized, my reality is that I'm sheltering in place with 5 people, so my family. And yet someone else's reality is that they are all alone. And there are challenges to each of those realities, but I am really sensitive about the fact that if we do know people who are living alone during this time, that those folks in particular need us to be checking in on them. And so, Lynette, I don't know if you want to say any more about this idea like of having someone to check in with to make sure you're working through these steps.
Yeah, I think just in addition to what you said, that you might have different people for different aspects of your life. So you might have a therapist that you check in with, you might have a friend who really understands your family situation or your something that somebody you grew up with, or you might have a work friend that can identify with the challenges that you're facing with, your technology set up at home or whatever it might be. I think that there are different people you can identify for different things, but it's really important to have at least one person.
Yeah, checking in on you. And I think it's important too. It's that person that, can be really honest, and you don't have to put up that facade, right? You can say, no, I'm really, really having a hard time. This sucks. And that they can listen and create space for that, but then also help you get unstuck, right? Sometimes it's through perspective, sometimes it's through humor, sometimes it's through a good song. Again, it's your personal wellness kit, but I think we just really want to highlight that these social connections, we know that this is such a protective factor. So if you don't have someone currently that you're really on a weekly basis checking in with, make sure that you develop that. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and just to interject, we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, great. Well, we're really in the home stretch. I think we wanted to talk a little bit. I know some of you are in the mental health profession, or again, in some kind of a helper role. And so we wanted to bring sort of a framework for looking at this current situation and the challenges, a framework that's really near and dear to us as experiential therapists. So Lynette, did you want to talk about this piece?
Yeah, I think going back to what I was saying earlier about having this shared blanketed experience cast upon all of us, it's just such an interesting thing to know that your individual experience may be different, but we're all coping with the same challenges. And so when working with clients, my first thought was, my mind just went immediately to Gary Stouffer and Tony Alvarez's experiential wave theory. And it's an experiential therapy framework that identifies where we are with the clients during the activity, at all points of the activity. And within that framework, there's 4 different assessment points that are up on your screen, looking at the belief system, the therapeutic relationship, the engagement of the client, and the physical setting that you're in, and whether that's a Zoom setting or in-person setting. Assessing all of those points is really your guidebook on how to approach the next step. And when you have a guidebook, you'll be able to go to something that it will work. You believe in it, you've studied it, you understand it. And that might simply be, for non-helpers, in terms of therapists or educators, that might certainly be your belief system, a religious system that you grew up with, or just something that intrinsically, like internally, this, you have confidence that this works. And so if you have whatever your theoretical framework is, or your belief system, just really knowing that and going back to it, using it as your guidebook. But specifically for helpers that are working with clients, one of the things on the experiential wave that I love the name of it, is the squiggly. And a squiggly really isn't a problem unless it interferes with the direction that the client is trying to go. But welcoming squigglies, acknowledging them, it's just like that hot spot on your foot, acknowledging that there's something in your way that needs to be explored and needs to be understood and needs to be evaluated as far as, will this help me? Can I use this to help me? Or do I need to go a different direction because it's not going to let me pass? So don't ignore your squigglies, just like your hot spots.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think, if I think about a global pandemic squiggly, right? That's a big one.
Everybody's squiggly right now.
It's everybody's squiggly.
I've ever known, yeah.
It is, but you said something that really hit me, which is it's only a problem if it's getting in the way of me just every day making progress, right? Or moving forward, or even just like being me. I was thinking about my kids, and I was thinking about, I have 3 children, ages 17 and 15 and 9. And my 17-year-old is a senior, and I know a lot of those losses that got mentioned on the chat box, she's lost prom and graduation and time with friends and time with her boyfriend and all kinds of things. And yet I'm watching her through this completely hold on to her sense of self and what a gift that is, right? So there's this huge squiggly in her life, but it's not interrupting, or it's not, I guess, getting in her way of still connecting with those values, those important things about who she is. And I think that that's a really great reminder that this is a challenge, but we are still the people that we are, with our gifts and our abilities and our values. And so how can we, I guess, use this as an opportunity to still hold on to those things about ourselves.
Yeah.
And help our clients do the same.
Right.
The other thing, and we just felt like we would be remiss if we didn't mention it, but for helpers in particular, vicarious trauma is real. Your sponge can only absorb so much human suffering. I mean, that's true for all of us. So I guess whether you're a helper or not, you might be experiencing some compassion fatigue, some burnout, some inability to feel empathy even sometimes. I know that I've been on a lot of Zoom calls lately, and sometimes I'm hearing other people share how they're struggling, and I just start getting this like anxious feeling, like I can't handle this, I can't handle this. And it's been really interesting for me as a social worker with my students in particular to figure out, how do I hold space for other people's suffering without making it my own, without taking it on and making it my own. And so if you are feeling like you're taking on other people's suffering in a way where it is becoming yours, you might notice some of the same cognitive and behavioral and physical symptoms that we mentioned earlier, which are some of those warning signs, right? And if you notice that, then it's important for you to get help as well, right? I used to do a program called Ride to Recovery for female veterans who were military sexual trauma survivors. And we would cycle during the day on our bikes, and then we do group work in the evenings. And I remember riding my bike with them, and a group of veterans came up behind me, and they were like badass women. They far better cyclists than I was. And I remember two of them forming like a chain behind me with their hands on my back, going up this really incredibly steep pass. And they formed this human chain of like helping me. And I couldn't speak because it was so, well, I couldn't speak because I couldn't breathe, but it was so overwhelming emotionally. And as we got to the peak of the hill, this one woman, a client, said, "Hey doc, don't worry about it. Even the helper needs help sometimes." And I just, whoosh, I just started, those of you know me, I'm a big crybaby. So I just started sobbing. And, but it's a really, that story is such a touch point for me, especially in these times where there is no shame in the struggle. And if you are a helper and you are still on the front lines of being there for other people in any way during this time, please pay attention to what's going on for you so that you get that support as well. We're going to leave you with some national mental health resources. Again, these are largely focused on a U.S. audience, and I recognize the limitations of that for those of you that are calling in from other places. I can certainly do some due diligence to send Sherry out some additional possible global resources. I do really encourage you.
Sorry, there have been really good suggestions.
Awesome.
There's some India resources, Spain. Someone had a global website for your area, so I think that's covered.
So we have already built a community of support through this webinar. So thanks to those of you that have been sharing those resources. I think you'll have access, obviously, to this PowerPoint and this presentation. You know, we just really wanted to end with some Q&A, any kind of check-in or anything that you're curious about.
And everyone can put their questions in the chat, or if they'd like to speak, they can raise their hand. It's a little button that you push, and then I can allow you to speak. So.
There's a request for more compassion fatigue resources, so we could maybe add a few links into the PowerPoint for that, and we could probably add the global suggestions that were made into the resource list to the PowerPoint before it gets sent out.
Yeah, that's an easy fix. Absolutely.
Somebody's asking about potential other platforms for group meetings besides Zoom.
I know people have talked about Skype, Facebook, Google Hangouts. Those of you that know me know that I'm not the biggest techie, but I think that there are different platforms that you can use. I know Zoom's had some compromises lately to security. And I do know too that if you're a therapist, there are HIPAA compliant for the United States folks, certain privacy and confidentiality laws that we have in place. Lynette could probably speak to that a lot more than I could.
Yeah, I'll just say that the federal HIPAA laws have been relaxed during this emergency. However, it's super important to recognize that individually you have to assess your client's needs. And again, back to domestic violence, if that's an issue for a client, then the other non-HIPAA compliant options should not be used. But right now it is relaxed, and really all that means is that they're not going to fine you. It doesn't mean that they're any more secure than they were before HIPAA relaxed the rules. But so we're trying, at least in my agencies, we're trying to stay as HIPAA compliant as possible and still meet the client's needs.
There's a couple more platforms mentioned in the chat, and we can add those as a resource list for everybody. Somebody's looking for resources on adapting experiential clinical interventions now that we're all doing the online counseling thing.
Oh my gosh, I would encourage you to, well, of course I would encourage you to join the Association for Experiential Education because it's a community, it's a wealth of resources. But as a quick introduction, you can also join the Therapeutic Adventure Professional Group Facebook group. I can think of different practitioners off the top of my head, Michelle Cummings, Jen Stanchfield, Chris Cavert, Tim Walther. Oh my gosh, there are so many people that have been creating online platforms that are activity-based for individuals, families, and groups. So it's a really, really creative community of practitioners. Lynette, I don't know if you want to say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a wealth of resources in there right now. Also, I mean, if just joining your traditional therapy Facebook group. Facebook seems to be the place where great ideas are shared. And I know like Maury Long in Florida is doing some webinars on experiential work, working with children, parenting. She did an earlier AEE webinar on parenting during this crisis. So there's just a wealth of information. I'd start with TAPG. The Facebook group is called TAPG.
I feel like our community, it's been really a source of great hope for me. Experiential educators by nature are problem solvers. And so kudos to all the people who, in the midst of managing their own emotions and their own crisis and trauma reaction to this pandemic, have also been able to like engage their creative brain to keep giving us great tools. I just really want to thank those people.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, a lot of the resources that are being mentioned in the chat are available on our webpage, and as well as a lot of those webinars that AE has hosted, but also Michelle Cummings and Amy Climbers and so many of the other great people that are out there doing amazing things. So we're trying to gather as many of those resources in one place for you all as we can. If you have more to add, please email us. We're happy to add those resources. Again, the other webinars that we posted so far are available. All our previous webinars are available online. And then we'll be doing another webinar talking about, kind of tech resources. Kakori is an app that two of our longtime members have they've developed, and they're going to be doing a webinar about how to use that and how to add activities to it next week. So that one will happen next Friday. And we're going to keep adding to our list of webinars as the need comes along. And we will make this presentation, the webinar, and any of the resources available on our website, as well as sending it out to each of the attendees. So.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Unplug right now, go outside, get some fresh air, and take good care of yourselves during this tough time. We're definitely here for you. Our contact information is listed if you need anything.
Thank you so much, Christine and Lynette. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.